Hello everyone, welcome to Eternity Screening, where today we're going to be doing another Hooptober video. This time we're doing 1922's Nosferatu, directed by F.W. Murnau, starring Max Shreck, who plays the inimitable Count Orlok. Or is he inimitable? Because this film was quite controversial when it came out for being a completely blatant rip-off of Bram Stoker's Dracula. This might be arguably one of the very first feature-length horror films. It has been referenced to death, has been critically lauded since its release, and is kind of, despite its shortcomings, which we'll get into, is kind of an indispensable monument in the horror canon, one that you kind of have to see. And it is free on YouTube, so if you're watching this now and you're even interested in watching Nosferatu, I'd recommend you just do it because it's literally free.
As a tidbit before we get into the heart of the review, I was very interested to learn that not only were the Stoker family estate incredibly angry at the creation of this film, but they actually successfully took it to court and won. And the punishment was to have all the copies destroyed.
Yeah. So we are lucky to have it today.
Yeah. We may be living in a world without Nosferatu.
And we were almost without so many classic silent films, so
yeah,
you know, this could have easily been another lost film. The same nearly happened to Metropolis and such, but what did you think of Nosferatu?
Well, I'll be completely honest with you. I actually found it to be quite an average experience, and I know that's not going to go down very well with a lot of horror fans if we're catering to that demographic in this series of reviews. But having seen a couple of other German expressionist films recently, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari in particular, I found that this was just quite plain in its representation of a lot of its set pieces and scenes and the way things are orchestrated. I think focusing on something I did really like about the film, Max Shreck as Count Orlok was fantastic.
Yep.
And the makeup and costume design that all went into that is so distinct, so brilliantly stylized and unique, and as a consequence, completely iconic to this day. I love all that, and he is very expressive with his face and
monstrous.
Very monstrous, very sort of disgusting and eerie. That stuff all works. And to be fair, a lot of the performances throughout the film are also very effective in their sort of, as a consequence of the medium, it is all sort of a lot of it facial.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But yeah, they all do like really good job. I think of the guy back in Germany who goes crazy. I forget the character's name, but like
the professor.
He becomes obsessed early on with Count Orlok, and the more like his influence sort of comes over to Germany, the more frightened and kind of deranged he becomes, and I think he's brilliant as well.
Yeah. Well, I think something this film is missing, that you sort of briefly referenced there, is the German expressionist element. It's not actually a very German expressionist film at all, outside of it just being German and black and white. It's quite plainly shot. For the most part, and it's quite flat. And I don't know, I have a feeling this may even just be pre-German expressionism, because you don't have tons of these. Obviously you have like some pretty amazing sets in this film, some great like outside shooting, which must have been ridiculously expensive to do at the time.
Yes.
And some great like sets and miniatures and all this kind of stuff. But for the most part, the film is very plain and flat, is how I would describe it. I don't think. And I think the core of it comes down to, even though it sort of generates the atmosphere quite effectively, in a similar way, it reminds me a lot of the 30s version of Dracula with Bela Lugosi, where the film is all atmosphere and doesn't really do a whole lot with the material of Bram Stoker. Because I think that despite how many times it has been adapted, I think that Dracula is actually quite a difficult thing to adapt. It's very back and forth between different locations, very, very slow build, and has a lot of sort of, psychic goings on.
Yes, a lot of it. Well, I mean, the original story is told through
like diary entries,
letters, newspaper articles, things like that. It's almost kind of like a book equivalent of found footage. And so as a consequence, a lot of it, the atmosphere is cultivated through a kind of almost like an emptiness of like everything feels quite sort of barren, and that's quite a hard thing to, because you're often getting something told to you after the fact from a character that's like already experienced these things, and it's kind of like that lack of connection can be difficult to translate, but also creates this kind of haunting experience of like, oh, I haven't been able to prevent this thing from happening, or things like that. Like, I think in the book of the Voyage of the Demeter, the way that's described in the book, with this kind of article about how this ship just arrives and it's ghostly, and everyone who goes down to the beach sort of has this haunting feeling to them, and like it's one of the of many of the books I've read, is genuinely one of the most sort of standout, chilling things. And like you say, I don't know how you translate that into a filmic sense without it being a bit goofier or a bit less
I think it's
harrowing.
particularly hard without sound, and obviously I'm no expert on silent films, but I've seen a fair few. And when you compare this to something like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, it's quite similar, but does, like, number one, it's way more visually interesting.
Oh my God.
Compared to this, and really does kind of goes into that German expressionist kind of feeling and really generates a lot of atmosphere. This feels like it's a lot more interested in the machinations of the plot, and
Right.
feels kind of run-of-the-mill, I guess. It's like, if you know the story of Dracula, I don't feel like you're going to get a lot from this. And of all the adaptations I've seen of the story of Dracula, by far the most interesting one for me is the Francis Ford Coppola one with Gary Oldman, because whilst it's really out there and wacky and doesn't stay completely loyal to the book, I think it communicates the sense of horror and romance of that book way more effectively than this
It's
does.
also just like, it has a specific fantastical quality to it that just feels really, like, it feels like, Coppola was super passionate and about sort of telling the story through his own lens. And I guess what we're seeing here is the template for all Dracula and vampire and much horror to follow. And I guess going back to the source, as individuals who grew up in a time, as basically everyone has at this point, because the film is so old, it's kind of hard to separate this from what it's gone on to influence. And especially having seen as many Dracula films as we both have, there's no kind of sense of surprise or wonderment on a raw storytelling level anymore. It's all about how it's orchestrated on, like, the set design level, on the performance level, on an atmosphere level. And this has it in its most sort of rudimental fashion. For me, what I got the most out of this film was the kind of approaching it from like a historical angle of just kind of like looking at it as a piece of history, as like an essential part of the movie landscape. But it's a hard thing to kind of qualify compared to more contemporary films, because my level of assessment for it is just completely different, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, but I guess with silent films, you can often lean, I mean, sort of, I guess this is all retrospective, but as a viewer you can kind of lean on to get like a lot of enjoyment from them, because they're obviously so different to what films are now. You can often lean on like the atmospheric level, which like I think does a lot for films like Haxan, which we reviewed in a previous Hooptober. Whilst it's like a totally different film to this, has real moments of like visual startling images and like really creepy moments in it, even with the sort of inherent goofiness that seems to come from silent films, like when you're watching them nowadays. But at the same time, I don't want to go easy on it just because it's a silent film. If you watch, for example, any sort of Buster Keaton or Charlie Chaplin film, you can see that a lot of those silent films have like real character development and like humor and like depth to them. So it's not that this film wasn't capable of that. I just feel like it doesn't seem all that interested in creating an atmosphere or telling a particularly interesting story, and it feels almost kind of quite spectacle focused in a way. And I wish it was more creepy, because at the end of the day it feels very, very goofy and not very creepy. And when you watch something like Haxan, or even an old film, I can't remember if it was silent or not, when we watched The Testament of Dr.
That
Magoo.
isn't silent.
It's not silent, but it's like of a similar era. That's a really creepy film and has like really creepy elements to it, despite how old it is. And the same with The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. It has genuinely
Well, that would be
that's
my direct comparison point. Dr. Caligari kind of did what I wish this film did. And perhaps it was my fault for having that expectation of it, because I don't know, the set design in particular of Dr. Caligari, it embeds you in this world that is so specific and so
weird,
uncomfortable and uncanny and unnerving. And this film had only little glimmers of that, only little elements here and there. Like, sure, Count Orlok, he's that, and Count Orlok's castle has that element to it.
The best section is, similarly to the 30s Universal version of Bela Lugosi, the best section is the bit where he first meets with Count Orlok / Dracula, right?
Yeah.
Because that's the best bit of that.
What I was going to say,
30s film, right?
yeah. The 30s film makes similar mistakes, and again, the saving grace is an amazing performance by the lead actor playing Dracula. Like, Lugosi is unbelievable in that film, but the rest of the film is quite tepid. I guess one thing that would be interesting to dive into, though, would be sort of discussing some of the things that this film changes about Dracula, because it was acknowledged around the time as an unofficial adaptation.
Yeah,
of
I think
Dracula.
they literally said that they were just going to adapt it because I guess the lines between adapting a book and copyright law for film, given that film was relatively...
It was in its infancy.
Yeah, I'm guessing that they thought they could just get away with it. And also, obviously, they were in Germany. Yeah. So they just thought, fuck it, we'll do it and we'll get away with it.
Yeah. So as a consequence, they of course changed a few story details. Obviously they changed some character names, but beyond that, in terms of story details, one that I quite like is that obviously instead of arriving in England, he arrives in Germany, but when Count Orlok arrives in Germany, the deaths of the people in the nearby town are attributed to a plague, and he just sort of goes around on like a bit of a killing spree rather than, you know,
trying to seduce people.
Yeah. It's like, it's far less sexualized, although there is definitely that component. And I quite like the plague thing, actually, because it played into an angle that I like about the Dracula story, which is the paranoia that he brings with him, and this kind of idea of that fear of the foreign, and kind of simultaneously kind of you analysing it and also kind of poking fun at it. But I want to talk about that sort of side of things a little bit more in a bit. But
I think it's a change they had to make, because I think this film was trying to be shocking. And when you learn about the intentions of the filmmaker, it's kind of hard to get away from that. But even watching this film, you kind of get the sense that the film is sort of trying to be like a bit more of a spectacle, like I said. And to be more spectacular, that I think one of the crucial changes they made, which we've already talked about, is making Dracula much more monstrous and hideous and creepy with these giant hands and creepy long nose and this sort of deformed looking face thing that he has going on. So because they did that, I think they kind of had to take a separate route to the sort of sexual deviancy, whereas Bela Lugosi as Dracula, I wouldn't call him handsome necessarily.
He had like a gravitas.
Yeah, exactly. Or like Gary Oldman is a better example, because it's like he's kind of hot but also really creepy, and that's kind of what Dracula is supposed to be, right? He's supposed to be kind of hot, kind of creepy, whereas with this, you wouldn't be able to do the romance or sort of falling in love element with Count Orlok and his giant hands.
No, that's true. Yeah. And then I guess the finale of the film is where the sort of meaner insert character decides to instead I believe in the original Dracula is that they confront Dracula. You know, they have the whole, you know, Van Helsing, and they like hunt him down. Well, there's the idea of, rather than a calculated plan to try and kill Dracula, this film changes it into a specific self-sacrifice of one woman who reads that if a pure-hearted woman offers her own blood willingly to Orlok, then he will be killed. Thus is the case. He drinks her blood, and he's like, I don't know, so like enraptured or like sort of transfixed by the whole process. He just poof. He stands in the sunlight and gets poofed to death. Which I don't know how you feel about that choice to amend.
Tell me if I'm wrong, but in the book, don't they sort of they have an elaborate plan to like sort of ensnare him, to sort of like capture him, right?
I think so.
I haven't read the book, but I've seen so many film versions.
Yes, yeah. I'm pretty sure that's how
I think that's what they do. I much prefer that, to be honest, to what they did in this film. As with a lot of old films, the ending to this is completely abrupt.
Yes.
And just kind of, and it's over type thing. Yeah, I can't say I love that change, to be honest. I much prefer the sort of tricking, because Dracula's kind of a trickster, right? Because, you know, he's kind of flying around and then he's like changing people and controlling people and all this kind of stuff. I much prefer that element of it. And if you're going to do something different, I kind of even prefer if you watch like the Hammer horror version, where they just make it super goofy and like, they're like fighting him with like crosses and shit. Like that's way more entertaining to me. I'd rather see like Christopher Lee going than just like, oh, and he goes poof.
Yeah, I mean, when I was watching it, I kind of misunderstood the ending in that I thought that his obsession with this one woman was so transfixing in of itself that that's what causes him to kind of die, and that it's not the self-sacrifice element; it's his own kind of lustful nature gets the better of him.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that they basically beat evil with good at the end is actually a way less compelling plot point. Essentially.
It feels very.
And it's also like, so we defeated him with the Virgin. Like, but I guess there's a level to which there's a constraint in just how much time you have, how much runtime you can realistically squeeze out of a silent film, given the constraints of the medium. I mean, I also wanted to talk about something I was reading about this film, which was that there was some suggestion about that whether or not the representation of Count Orlok was anti-Semitic.
I mean, probably.
Now, see,
who fucking knows?
Now, here's the interesting thing. So I was reading into it, and so the original Dracula kind of touches on similar themes, but not specifically anti-Semitic ones, but ones of a fear, essentially xenophobia.
I think it kind of taps into an element. The original text must tap into an element of xenophobia of some kind.
Yeah, exactly. As well as like a fear of like sort of sexual deviancy that comes with the foreign, and I think a lot of it was poking fun at that. That was my understanding of it, or that's definitely a reading of it.
It's hard to say, because obviously what we have to do as a modern audience watching this is define what is goofy on purpose and what just looks goofy to us because we're
separated from
exactly.
Yeah, no, I understand that. But I think within the original text, my interpretation of it at least is that it is kind of, there is a level of satire within the character of Dracula, because the Victorian era was such a sexually repressed society. All of the weird shit was going on, but it was just going on under the scenes.
Course,
and so it made all of that, the sexual stuff you weren't allowed to do, even grimier and grottier, because you had to do it in these sort of secluded, dark places. And so that's kind of a big part of what Dracula was supposed to represent. I think Stoker was poking fun at that a bit by making it so dramatic. But anyway, I think a similar thing could be said for this film with anti-Semitism, in that, from what I can understand, Murnau, the director, was apparently gay.
Right.
And was also friends with a bunch of Jewish people, one of which who stars in the film. So the kind of the taboo angle of it, and the kind of, attacking sort of an outside ostracized peoples, probably doesn't play into it in a direct sense, in a like, oh, we're attacking this group of people. It more likely is a kind of comment on that.
Well, I guess it's really hard to say. I mean, when you have a German film from the 20s where the bad guy is a creepy dude with a massive nose, it's always going to be part of the conversation, whether or not it's satire.
Well, people have come to conflicting sort of
it's like
conclusions on that, essentially.
The question is ultimately sort of the unanswerable one of like, what is satire and what is... It's sort of how you interpret it, right? Because on the one hand, you can say it's satirising something, if you want to read into the subtleties of it, or you could say it's not satirising it, it's using people's prejudices and sort of stirring them up, right?
Right.
That seems to be the general split I have in my mind when it comes to these kind of things. Maybe like you could even look at like American History X in the way that portrays black people, because whilst that film is sort of quite explicitly trying to satirise something, ends up playing into a lot of negative stereotypes that sort of reinforce the thing it's trying to knock down. So,
I get that, yeah. So, and especially with something like Dracula, where like the satirical elements, if they are there, aren't particularly obvious because it's played as a horror. You're supposed to be frightened.
Well, and the book to me sounds incredibly subtle and sort of subversive.
Yeah.
So, I mean, ultimately trying to read into the intentions of an author is pointless and fruitless anyways, yeah. So, to me, the film isn't making enough of a grand statement anyways. Especially when you know the backstory of it and you know how cynical of a production it was, it doesn't take away from some of the sort of raw qualities of the film in terms of how it looks. I think it's mostly a pretty well constructed narrative based on, a pretty good book, and has a lot of, great costumes, and especially in the first section of the film is like very well shot. It kind of feels like very cynical film. It's just when you know the backstory, just very cynical.
Okay, fair enough.
I would say.
So, I mean, what would you give that at the end of it then?
I'd give it a 5 out of 10. And an element of that is me sort of acknowledging the importance of it, and the fact that this is almost, maybe one of the first horror films, if not the first, and how out there it must have been at the time.
It's impossible to view it through that original lens. I can only imagine how mind-blowing it would
some
be.
of the visual elements being still quite effective to this day, like some of the costumes. I also love some of the shots they did with the shadows with his like hands, that kind of stuff. Especially the bit where I think he's like in her room and he's supposed to be invisible, but you can just like see his shadow hands. That stuff's great, but outside of that, I find it pretty tedious.
I agree. I'm almost completely echo everything you say. 5 out of 10.
Well, it's us on the same page once again.
As
Who
always.
would have fucking guessed it? But anyways, if you've made it this far, thank you for watching. If you like the video, please press like and subscribe. If you dislike the video, press dislike and tell us why you disliked it in the comments. That will show us. And we'll be back next time with more Hooptober stuff, so make sure you check out the page if you've enjoyed this, and we'll see you next time. Peace.
Peace.